welcome back. I'm going to be reading this verbatim to our readers, just the first chapter or two paragraphs. Again, we are reading Metu, Neter, Vol.1, under the studies of Ra'un Nefer Amen. Before we get into the hemispheres of the brain, there are 4 quadrants that we don't use, apparently, but typically we're taught to use just the left and the right. So we're going to break down this chapter over the next episodes to make sure you fully understand what that means to the brain and how people think and why they think the way they do and what stops them from being the best that they can be. The world is on a collision course with disaster, not only from or because of the threat of a nuclear war, but from the massive collapse of its institutions: political, social, economical, religious, spiritual, educational, etc. It is the combined failure of these institutions and traditions it is at the root of the widespread decay and stagnation that we are witnessing in just about every nation in the world. The state of affairs. A Comatian, ancient Egyptian priest would say, it is due to the lack of self-knowledge. This injunction has been quoted often by scholars, yet none have given much insight into its true meaning. Now, we can go on about Da Vinci and Leonardo and Einstein and Plato's and Confucius theory, but if they were just here to confuse us without actually giving us the real skrill, then they did great. And I guess us as humans still keep failing. But let's go on. The lack of knowledge. In the explanation of what is knowledge of self, I ought to begin because it seems most natural at the beginning. But that would just take us into such an abstruse discussion that it makes better sense to start instead at a familiar midpoint. And I like the way he breaks it down. That's why, again, I'm reading it verbatim. So let's start with what you're doing right now, this very moment. Yes, I'm reading, but you are listening, okay? But as you're listening, I want you to make an effort of becoming aware of the fact that you are involved in 2 sets of functions right now. On one hand, you are making the effort to keep your attention on the sequence of words as I'm speaking to you. And on the other hand, without your conscious effort and awareness, the meaning of what you are listening to is taking shape and form in your own mind. Now, these 2 sets of functions are more apparent in more complex activities. So while you need to think of getting up and going somewhere, you need not to think of the details, the muscular activities involved in getting up itself, because these are taken care of for you. Now, when you type, dance, play an instrument, perform in a sports drive, or write, or etc., you can become aware of the fact that some of the part of your activities is performed without a conscious effort. Wouldn't you agree? Now, this dualization of your being into 2 fundamental sets of functions is the central theme of your knowledge of self. Your self-knowledge. So one part of your being is concerned with activities that you have to direct, while the other deals with activities that occur with your attention to them. Now, you may have noticed that I have not gone into little trouble to avoid the popularity designations of the voluntary versus the involuntary, or the conscious versus the subconscious behaviors, right? But we will later see. So for now, as Ra'un Nefer Amen goes on to say, let's label them as willed and automatic, respectively. Okay? So we have willed and automatic. Now, it might not surprise you, because you already know that great performers make poor teachers. Yet, you might be surprised to know that you could not give an accurate description of how you walk or articulate the words that you speak. You fail for the same reason that most great performers do as teachers. The performance of the task in question is carried out without your attention and awareness of the intricate details involved. You direct your attention to the desired result, and the other part of your being unattended takes care of the execution. I didn't know I was going to fall, but I did. But I made that very gracefully. I mean, I skipped, but I skipped, and I skipped, and I skipped. And remember, have those one falls where you just want to fall, but you try to catch yourself all the way down. It wasn't voluntary when to fall, but you involuntary thought you were going to fall, but you kept going, kept going. That'd be my analogy. But let's just go back and redirect your attention to those involuntary versus those voluntary moments, okay? So it should be obvious by now that there is an existent and a vast difference in the knowledge and the capabilities between the two parts of our being. While the willed part of our being has to be instructed, and it is no better in its performance than the quality of the material taught to it, like now. So the automatic part of being directed by an omniscient factor, let's realize that it directed the formation of the physical part of our being the very moment that our pre-generator sperm and egg came together. So what if the willed part of our being, instead of learning from the nescient will of others, we learned from the omniscient, being that directs the automation within us? So, for example, instead of the limited in knowledge, learning from the limited in knowledge, learned from the omniscient. So the answer to these questions will provide full insight into the nature of our being, the cultures we have produced, the shaping forces of our history, and explain the causes of the problems besetting mankind, and will also show definitely the way to their solutions. Now, it is very sufficient to say for now that according to the African spiritual tradition, the automation within us is in touch with all functions in the world, and it is capable of manipulating them. Now, with proper direction, we will come to see that there are three kinds of people in the world. One type inclines towards relying on the willed part of being for survival and flourishment. The second on the omniscient, intelligent, and the automation. And the third on an equilibrium of both parts of being. In fact, all cultures fall into one of these categories. So these categories do not represent distinct types, but stages in the spiritual development of individuals and nations. The first stage corresponds to the polarization in the willed, which is the outer, part of the being. The second in the polarization and the inner, and the third to their equilibration. We can better comprehend this if we paraphrase it as the stages of. So, the first stage would be 1, reliance on the part of being with limited knowledge and capability. 2, reliance on the part of being with infinite knowledge and capability. Or the equilibrium between the two. And another phrase will explain further the polarization in learning from outside of ourselves, from someone else, and learning from within ourselves, and the equilibrium of both approaches. We'll go into the polarization and reliance on externals, tools, machineries, medicines. Polarization and reliance on internals, the power of the spirit, and the equilibrium of both methods. Ra'u Nefer Amen goes on to say, we can begin to see which cultures shape up to which categories. The first type, polarized in the cultivation of the external part of being, corresponds fundamentally to the Western men and some Orientals, while the opposite, polarized in the cultivation of the internal, corresponds to the black race and some Orientals. Success and the cultivation of both parts has only been truly achieved by the Cometians, the ancient Egyptians, who, for the record, belong to the black race. Now, this is not about, I don't want to stop the tape. I'm racist. This is still how we all uncover ourselves. You are I, and I am you. If we can just stop the colorization and understand that we all came from one being. And I think we found that out this year when we realized the DNA was all structured. So we'll get to that DNA later, which is really fun. I like to bring up a lot of stuff if you have not read my website. But this right here is taking us to the beginning, because on my website, I get deep when it comes to my analytical skills. I start from a little piece of grain and I just create a whole planet. So it's very, very informative for us all. Again, I don't like connecting too much of our ancientology, but I will go on to say this last paragraph because it does connect a lot of where we are now. I mean, if you look at our history today, there's a lot of TV shows about sci-fi and connection astrology and ancientology and the Egyptians, and it just doesn't still seem to me that they have yet figured out the story, or they have yet connected all the dots, or they have yet wanted to clearly define who they are or who we are in a clear vision without wanting to confuse us, Confucius again. So we can clearly understand why, for example, all the fundamental skills and institutions of civilizations begin with black nations. Kemet, Babylon, Elam, Harappa Valley, civilization, Kush, Ethiopia, Indus Kush, Black India, and Canaan. Because of their people's ability to learn from the internal part of being, with its storehouse of knowledge concerning every secret of the world, they were able to intuit 6,000 plus years ago the knowledge that forms the basis of our civilization, religion, mathematics, geometry, medicine, astronomy, writing, literature, agriculture, metallurgy, if I pronounce any word in here, please let me know. Metallurgy, government, architect, painting, sculpturing, algebra, science, etc. Okay? Because Western man is polarized in the cultivation of the external part of his being. He had to learn these skills from others, the blacks and the Orientals, who were able to learn these things intuitively. This brings us to the critical part of our introductory discourse, where the underlying all of the functions of the automations within us is a program of order. The maintenance of our bodily processes in a state of order according to this program is what we call health. We will come to see that this very same program of order is in charge of regulating the social behavior of people. Where it finds full expression in the social arena, there is mortality, wealth, spirituality, and prosperity. True religion, we will come to see, deals with the techniques of communicating with the director of the automation within us, in order to gain access to the power, the storehouse of information. In us, it is the host of the shaping factors of our lives. Ra'u Nefer Amen goes on to say that the world is in the sorry mess that it now finds itself because the dominant culture in the world is that of the external part of being. It is not enough to say that the external part of being does not know much about creating and maintaining order. For even if it did, it lacks the ability to generate order in the life of people. Hearing sermons and reading books, external means or moral behavior will make you as moral as reading books on healing will heal your illness. And that's why I started this podcast on the Metu Neturu. Because when you hear things that make sense to you, it will start connecting the dots to you, as it did for me. I went to church my whole life. I got out of church and still couldn't connect the dots. So finding this book, finding the literature, it really started connecting everything together. And I tell you, if they had taught math and science together, or even threw in some more astrology into our life as children, we would be much better off as people. This episode's going to go into the hemisphere of the brain. We will continue on to that, but I want you to understand how the brain works and why it lacks certain wisdom to move itself from one position to another. The three types of men. Why men think the way they do. Why do they not feel like they can be better than? What is holding us back? Why can't we just be self-sufficient? Why do we have to wait this long to become self-sufficient? Why did they hold so much stuff from us to be self-sufficient? Now, we can fully understand that the lack of wisdom in denouncing the Westerners as hypocrites for preaching doctrines of such high moral values, while their destructive acts in the world are unparalleled. The inner culture for accessing the program of order that is the shaping force of our harmonious social life and an essential prerequisite for man's spiritual growth and the flourishing of all social institutions has been displaced by the outer culture, which is far from equal to the task, although it is long on words on the subject of spirituality. So we're going to get into the hemispheres of the brain. To understand this subject, we must realize that underlying all mental activities are two sets of functions, one in charge of relating us and the variety of things in our environment to each other, and to the whole, and the other function is in charge of separating us and the variety of things in our environments from each other. So the latter functions, which corresponds to the left hemisphere of the brain, enable us, for example, to distinguish between the sounds made in speaking and verbal thinking, that we'll be able to speak and think verbally. The language function of the right hemisphere enables us to unify the words we perceive into phrases. These sentences and so on go into larger units that we'll be able to comprehend what has been spoken or thought. The act of speaking and verbal thinking are processes that occur in a series of steps, one at a time. The understanding of what is thought and said is a process that occurs in one step at a time. Now, since the act of speaking and verbal thinking are processes that occur at separate points in time, they are therefore carried out by the left hemisphere, which is in charge of all process of segregation and differentiation. Now, conversely, the act of extracting the significance from a series of related units, which is carried out into one step, is under the jurisdiction of the right hemisphere, which is in charge of all functions of unification and integration. And there's a slide I have called the Botanic Solids, I believe, on my webpage. It goes into explaining the second part of spirituality and the angelic angelic, the angels and the Metarus. Okay. So in summary of that hemisphere of the brain, Ra'u Neframen goes on to say that the left hemisphere of the brain is in charge of noting the differences between things, separating wholes into parts, and enabling us to deal with all subsequent sequential phenomena, me and my words, wholes presented pieces at a time. This mode of thinking is popularly known as the analytical stage. Okay. We call it the Cartesian, the surreal, the linear, the deducive, the segregative, etc. The right side is in charge of noting the similarities between things and their relation to each other and the whole, thus unifying them. So again, the left side is in control of noting the differences between things, separating wholes into parts, and enabling us to deal with all substantial, I had to go back and read that, didn't I? Phenomena, wholes presented pieces at a time. Again, the right side is in charge of noting the similarities between things and their relation to each other, and the whole, thus unifying them. So the mode of thinking in general is known as the synthetical side, the holistic side, or the congregative side, when it comes to the way we think about in general. So, although both functions are complementary, that is, their equal inputs are needed for every mental activity to be complete. So, most people have a predominance of one over the other. So, men have predominance of the left side, where women have predominance on the right side. Okay. When we speak of men in general, like I said, they're more left sided than women, and so are the members of the white race in comparison to the non whites. A well-known fact to the Western psychologists, okay? So we will come to learn that hemispheric differences are one of the main shaping forces of cultural differences and the historical events that such differences have engendered, okay? In fact, without this concept, there can be no science, no history, no psychology, or anthropology, or understanding of religion. So we really must understand how this breaks down. And we'll talk about that later on when we come to the differences and the patterns between the white and the black races, because they are very much well known, but it has a lot to do with the way we think. We can change that as people.